Imagine you live in a society where the average lifespan is 30 years. What's more, the healers in your village have some crazy notions about how to test for disease that often lead to drowning or suffocation. Now say you're 40 years old, 10 years over the average lifespan and feeling a bit lethargic. So you go see the healer for your spring checkup. First you jump up and down a little, then cough, then the tests only get more invasive from there. At the end, he assures you you're doing great for your age and you will likely live 1 or even 2 years longer. He thinks it's perfectly normal for someone to die in their early 40s and to be sick long before that, even though we know today this is not true at all. This is called normalcy bias. It's not really peer pressure so much as going along unthinkingly due to inertia and habit. In fact, society today suffers a great deal from this same problem. You would think we have advanced to an amazing degree since those times, but in reality we still have all the same issues. For every test you take, the result is measured using statistics. It's not based on whether something is mechanistically bad, but how you compare to the average for your age. But in a society where many people are deathly ill in their 40s and 50s, this just indicates you're on course for all the same diseases everyone else is getting, and you're probably heading for your grave on the same exact schedule. Many of the tests like biopsies, mammograms, and colonoscopies actually cause harm, and statistically the people who get those screening tests do significantly worse than the people who don't even bother. Not to mention they are painful and invasive.
Stick out your tongue.
Are we done?
Let me take your temperature.
No, that's not gonna happen.
And for many of these boogeymen, there's not even a proven mechanism by which they're harmful, or any real evidence that they're even correlated with harm. We've all had it drilled into us that HDL is good and LDL is bad, but is this really true?
However, by the early 1970s, even the American Medical Association had come in line with the others, the American Heart Association and the National Academy of Science, and all three organizations issued statements in the early 1970s that were virtually identical. These were official statements about diet and heart disease. The first thing these statements said was that Americans had cholesterol that was too high, and that it was important for Americans to lower their cholesterol. And they called for measuring cholesterol as a routine part of physical examinations, or even in early adulthood. So we want to make Americans anxious about their cholesterol levels at a very young age. We are instilling cholesterol anxiety in the population. Americans who were in the risk category should receive appropriate dietary advice, and Americans in the risk category should reduce their intake of saturated fats by substituting polyunsaturated vegetable oils. I put risk in quotation marks because they actually hadn't yet defined who was at risk. Were you at risk if your cholesterol was average at 240, or if your cholesterol was slightly high at 300, or if your cholesterol was low at 200? They hadn't decided who was at risk. So what I want to do now is look at three major studies that you all paid for. These were paid for with tax dollars, and these are the three studies that are mostly referenced in material that comes from our government promoting the lipid hypothesis. The first was the Framingham study that went on for 40 years in the town of Framingham, Massachusetts, where they were looking at risk factors for heart disease. And when the results came out, this was in 1987, they were published in a major journal summarized in this graph. And it does look as though if your cholesterol gets up into this level, it starts to get pretty scary. and you look like and it looks like you're quite at risk for heart disease if your cholesterol is in this interval or higher. Now, has anyone here ever taken statistics? Or sadistics, as my son calls them. Yeah. Okay. Do you notice something strange about this chart? If you look at the intervals, the first interval is 121 points. It goes from a cholesterol level of 84 to 204. Okay? Then the next interval is 30 points, and then 30 points, and then 30 points. And the last interval is 830 points. It goes from 295 to 1124. Now, if you had done that on your statistics test, you would have gotten an F. This is cheating. This is cheating. And this was published in the American Heart Journal. So I redrew the chart, and I made the intervals equal, and now it looks very different, doesn't it? Yes, if your cholesterol's up here at 1,000, anybody in this room who has cholesterol levels of 1,000? It's very rare. It's extremely rare. You are definitely slightly more at risk for heart disease, but not very much. It's certainly not something to get too frightened about. And as you'll notice, inside this circle between 185 and 285, this is basically a straight line. That means you're no more at risk if your cholesterol is 285 than if it's 185. So why are we making these huge changes in our diet?
In reality, there's only a tiny link between cholesterol and heart disease. Even people with the most extremely high LDL levels only have slightly more than normal levels of heart disease. However, I will say that it is somewhat incorrect that the line is flat between 185 and 285, which is the range of average levels of the time. There is actually a small peak in the middle. It is small and makes no difference to our message, but it is interesting and can be explained. You've certainly heard many times that your HDL being low is bad, but what is the supposed mechanism of this? The doctors don't have any clue at all. It's all merely associational, and you have to dig deep to get any answers. And the answers you will find aren't answers our corrupt American heart and medical associations want to be taught in medical school.
Mr. Evil.
Dr. Evil. I didn't spend 6 years in evil medical school to be called Mr. Thank you very much.
In reality, metabolic syndrome drives down your HDL. That is the one and only reason that this marker is associated with bad health. The HDL itself has nothing to do with anything. It is simply that it is driven down by another factor. Metabolic syndrome also drives down your LDL levels as well. Essentially, this is what happens when you have a fatty, damaged liver. In fact, it's your liver that creates almost all of your cholesterol in the first place, and the only reason HDL is going down as a bad health marker is because it's a marker of liver damage, aka metabolic syndrome. This is also how people wind up as type 2 diabetics. The liver gets more and more fatty and damaged until it can't hold on to glycogen very well anymore. It's also constantly shooting out sugar, which makes your pancreas work harder, and eventually you reach a tipping point and bam, you are now a type 2 diabetic.
Now the liver, I believe, is one of the unsung heroes or unappreciated heroes when it comes to human metabolism. And there are two processes I want to highlight, and that is the liver's ability to both make lipid and to make glycogen, the storage form of glucose. So it's the liver's one of the tricks the liver has to once glucose has been pulled in, it will store it. So it's just a way to help buffer the glucose levels in the blood. If glucose levels are high, the liver can pull in some of that, more than what it needs for its own energy demands. And then when glucose goes low, the liver can break that glycogen down and share it with the blood or with the body. So that's the definitions there, the production of fat and the production of glycogen. Insulin, of course, as it has its hand in so many things, also has its hand in these events as well. In particular, it stimulates both of them. Insulin will both stimulate the production of lipid and the production of glycogen. With insulin resistance in the liver, there's an interesting phenomenon, and it is reflective of the fact that insulin resistance is not just a global effect within the cell. It is not that every event that insulin used to do is not happening. And let me get into that, just to make that clear. When the liver is insulin resistant, lipogenesis is still activated when insulin comes knocking at the door, so to speak, when insulin binds its insulin receptor. So to make that clear, even if the liver is insulin resistant, insulin can still stimulate lipogenesis. In contrast, in the insulin resistant liver, insulin is less able to make glycogen, so it's less able to tell the liver to store glucose. And this loss of stimulating glycogenesis means we have a reduction. We actually end up, insulin loses its ability to prevent the breakdown of glycogen. So now we have glycogenolysis. This event is disrupted in insulin resistance. And so now we have a liver that is supposed to be holding on to glucose. It's actually letting it go. But it's not supposed to. Remember, that's the pathology here. Insulin is trying to stimulate, or it ought to be stimulating, glucose uptake and storage. It's not working anymore. So the liver doesn't get the signal not to break down glycogen, and so it does. It's not being inhibited, the glycogenolysis. And this, of course, drives up blood glucose levels. So once again, if we look at this paradigm of the progression towards full-blown type 2 diabetes, with the liver being insulin resistant, we've pushed that a little further down the road. The patient has progressed a little further towards full-blown type 2 diabetes. So they're getting this mounting hyperglycemia.
Metabolic syndrome and body-wide insulin resistance are essentially synonymous. Your liver both produces the sugar in your blood as needed, and it takes back excess sugar that you consume and turns it into glycogen. You can also have insulin resistance on the level of the cell, which can be caused by a high-carb diet that raises triglycerides high, pollution, smoking, and so on. But the liver is the real measure of metabolic health. I would go into the doctor for years, and my total cholesterol was always under 100. My ALT levels were also slightly up, no doubt from eating too many carbs, but it was about the same as the people my age at the time, so they said it was not a problem at all. They were actually enthusiastic about how amazingly healthy I was because I had such an incredibly low cholesterol.
What I do is just like you know, you know what I mean? Like,
At first, this was understandable as I looked to be in good shape, but my blood pressure kept creeping up, which they had no explanation for, and at the time I wasn't really overweight at all, so it was kind of an anomaly. But then I rapidly gained a large amount of weight. The real problem causing all of this was metabolic syndrome, and the weight gain was from stress, a bad diet, and probably from the medications they were giving me for high blood pressure. Many of them are known to lead to weight gain, type 2 diabetes, increased uric acid levels, and to feed into liver dysfunction. Aside from advising me to lose weight, the incredibly genius advice they had no answers for me at all, even though my blood pressure issues started long before the weight gain. I had uncontrolled blood pressure and was probably headed for an early grave sooner rather than later. I gave up on the doctors and threw out my pills, and started doing cardio like mad every day. That didn't solve my problems though, my blood pressure was just as bad. I dieted many times, and while I would lose weight, it always seemed to make it worse in the long run. I also worried it would take months or years to make a difference in my health, and now I didn't have just 20 pounds to lose like I had in the past, but over 100 pounds. And that could take literally years to get off at 1 pound a week, which is what is normally recommended. I'd fasted a little as a teenager from time to time, but I was always worried it would make me lose muscle, so eventually I stopped. Coincidentally, I started to see fasting videos pop up on YouTube at this time, and it seemed like the people involved were not losing any muscle. That's when I did my first 48-hour fast, which was 12 hours longer than the fast I used to do. This one was just miserable. I was sweating and shaking by the end, but I made it. I now know this is due to rapid loss of electrolytes, but this is a good thing by and large. If you have high insulin, you also have very high electrolytes, which causes swelling at a cellular level, which is really what causes systemic inflammation, high blood pressure, and many of the effects of aging because it impairs your immune system ability to function.
And it can still work quite well at the kidney level. And one of the jobs of insulin at the kidney level is to actually hold on to sodium. So that's actually a much more important factor for increasing the sodium in your body and causing high blood pressure than is the amount of sodium that you consume. If you consume a modicum of sodium but have very high insulin levels, your body's going to try very hard to hold on to all of that sodium. You can, on the other hand, consume a whole lot of sodium but have very good low insulin levels, and any excess sodium that you consume will just come out in your urine.
Now you might want to take salt while fasting, but while this will make you less uncomfortable, if your insulin is high, you most likely have far too much in the body already. For someone who has been on an extremely low salt diet or who had very low insulin levels going in, your salt levels can definitely become too low. I would tell you to talk to your doctor about salt, but they will almost invariably tell you to consume very little of it. Just be aware that you might need more salt in some circumstances, even if for most people losing electrolytes is actually a very good thing, but not always.
Alright! You! The one in the middle, what do you think? Come on!
A sponge!
What does sponge mean?
It means it's a great idea, but possibly not. I'm not being indecisive.
And it's really the salt that keeps your blood pressure high, this extra salt that's being held onto because of the high insulin. In fact, the next time I took my blood pressure at the doctor's office, after 4 weeks of fasting and doing one 72-hour fast per week, aside from the first week when I did a 48, my blood pressure levels were down to normal. And they had been as high as 180 over 105, which is very dangerous. All this in a few weeks and with little actual fat lost. It saved my life, and that's why I tell people about fasting as much as I do. It is really the insulin levels and metabolic syndrome killing people today. Whether it's heart disease, type 2 diabetes, or cancer, it all traces back to metabolic syndrome and high insulin. Fasting reverses this extremely quickly, and the fat you lose first comes out of the liver and visceral fat. That goes against what gym bros will tell you, but it's a fact. It's your liver that produces sugar for the bloodstream, and if you have a fatty liver, it uses the liver fat first of all for this purpose. Then it sends out any glycogen, and then finally, once that's gone, it uses triglycerides from the bloodstream to make sugar and ketones. When you eat carbohydrates, most of it becomes palmitic acid in the liver and is released into the bloodstream as triglycerides. When the levels become high from a high-carb diet, triglycerides combined with PUFAs are what cause ectopic fat, including a lot of visceral fat. This ectopic fat is not even in a fat cell, but in cells of your organs themselves. You can imagine a heart cell full of fat is not going to function correctly, for example, and it's certainly not helping your ability to exercise when your connective tissues become fatty and fragile. When you fast, these cells will release some of this fat into the bloodstream, or even burn it up on their own.
It's gonna autophagize those.
When you look at your blood work, cholesterol is largely irrelevant. But if your LDL does go very low, the culprit is metabolic disease, and this is also the reason your HDL may be very low. An even better marker is your ALT level, which should be as low as possible. Blood pressure is also a big symptom of metabolic syndrome, and one you should not ignore due to its lethality. Fasting can reverse all these problems quickly, but your diet is where they start. Sugar and wheat are tasty, but they can be quite lethal in the long run.